They sat across the mahogany table, a divide wider than the 10 years they had spent married. Richard adjusted his silk tie, sliding a check across the polished surface with a smirk that screamed pity. "Take it, Charlotte. It's enough to keep you in cardigans and cat food for the rest of your life. Don't embarrass yourself by asking for more." He thought he held all the cards. He thought she was just the quiet housewife who watered the plants and hosted his dinner parties. He didn't know that the chair he sat in, the office he bragged about, and the very ground beneath his Italian leather shoes belonged to her. Today wasn't a divorce, it was an eviction. The air conditioning in the conference room of Sterling, Holt and Associates, was set to a sterile, bone-chilling 68 degrees. It was a temperature designed to keep negotiations brisk and emotions tempered, but for Charlotte Sterling, it felt like the climate of her marriage for the last decade. She sat with her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress, off the rack, paired with pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. Across the table, Richard Sterling looked every inch the master of the universe he believed himself to be. His charcoal suit was bespoke, cut on Savile Row. His watch, a Patek Philippe Nautilus, cost more than Charlotte's first car. He was tapping a gold fountain pen against the legal pad, a rhythmic click, click, click that echoed his impatience. To his right sat his attorney, a shark of a man named Benedict Cross. Benedict was known in New York legal circles as the Butcher of Wall Street. He didn't just win divorces, he obliterated the opposition. To Charlotte's left sat Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur was 72, wore a tweed jacket that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and had been retired for 3 years until Charlotte called him last Tuesday. He looked less like a shark and more like a confused librarian. "Let's cut the theatrics, shall we?" Richard said, his voice smooth, carrying that practiced baritone that had charmed venture capitalists and board members for years. He didn't look at Charlotte. He looked at Arthur. "My offer is on the table. It is generous. Frankly, it's charity." Arthur adjusted his spectacles, squinting at the document. "Mr. Sterling, this stipend, it terminates after 3 years, and the lump sum is, well, considering the valuation of Sterling Dynamics." "Sterling Dynamics is my company," Richard snapped, his eyes finally flickering toward Charlotte with a mix of annoyance and amusement. "I built it. I run it." Charlotte arranged flowers in the foyer. "Let's not pretend there was an equal contribution here." Charlotte remained silent. She watched the way Richard checked his reflection in the darkened window overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The view was breathtaking. The Empire State Building, standing tall amidst a sea of steel and glass. This building, the Aurora Tower, was the jewel of the Midtown district. It was where Richard had insisted on moving his headquarters 2 years ago to signal his dominance in the tech sector. "Charlotte," Richard sighed, leaning forward, clasping his hands. He adopted the tone one might use with a slow child or a stubborn pet. "Look at me." She met his gaze. His eyes were icy blue, the same eyes she had fallen for in a coffee shop in Boston 12 years ago. Back then they were full of dreams. Now they were full of calculation. "I'm trying to help you," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "You have no resume. You haven't worked a day since we married. You have no marketable skills unless hosting a brunch is suddenly in high demand on LinkedIn. This settlement allows you to walk away with dignity. You can move back to wherever it is people like you go. Vermont? Open a knitting store. Be happy." "The offer is insufficient, Richard," Charlotte said softly. It was the first time she had spoken since entering the room. Richard blinked, genuinely surprised by the sound of her voice. "Insufficient?" He laughed, a short, barking sound. He looked at Benedict. "She says it's insufficient. Benedict, did we forget to include the coupon book for the grocery store? Benedict didn't smile. He just tapped the paper. Mrs. Sterling, under the prenuptial agreement, which, I remind you, you signed willingly, you are entitled to very little. Richard is offering you $500,000 and the Audi. If we go to trial, I will argue that you are entitled to nothing. And I will win. The prenup, Arthur interjected, his voice trembling slightly, was signed under duress, and arguably, without full financial disclosure. Duress? Richard slammed his hand on the table, the noise making Arthur jump. I bought her a life most women would kill for. I took her out of that crumbling apartment in South Boston and gave her a penthouse on Park Avenue. I gave her the world. You gave me a cage, Richard, Charlotte said, her voice steady, rising just an octave. A very expensive, gold-plated cage, and you kept the key. Richard sat back, loosening his tie. And now I'm opening the door. Fly away, little bird, before I decide to pluck your feathers. He checked his watch again. I have a lunch meeting at Le Bernardin in 20 minutes, with Isabella. The name hung in the air like toxic smoke. Isabella, his executive assistant. 24 years old, leggy and ambitious, the woman Charlotte had found wearing her bathrobe 3 months ago, the reason they were sitting at this table. Isabella is very excited about the renovation of the Hamptons house, Richard added cruelly. She has more modern tastes than you. Charlotte looked down at her hands. She twisted the wedding band she still wore. You're keeping the Hamptons house? I'm keeping everything, Charlotte, because I earned everything. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. Sign the papers, or don't. If you don't sign by noon, the offer drops by 50%. By tomorrow, I'll have security escort you out of the penthouse. He turned to the window, admiring the view of the city one last time. God, I love this building, he murmured to himself. The power, the location, it fits me. Charlotte looked at Arthur. The old lawyer gave her a barely perceptible nod. Sit down, Richard, Charlotte said. Richard froze. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with a tone of authority he had never heard from her before. He turned slowly, his brow furrowed. Excuse me? I said, sit down, she repeated. She reached into a tote bag, a battered leather thing that Richard had always hated, and pulled out a thick file folder. She placed it on the table with a heavy thud. I'm not signing your settlement, Richard, because we need to discuss the rent. Richard stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. A silence stretched across the room, heavy and suffocating. Then the corner of his mouth twitched, and he burst into laughter. It was a loud, incredulous sound that bounced off the glass walls. The rent? He wiped a tear from his eye. Oh, this is rich. Is this some kind of metaphorical nonsense? Are you charging me for the emotional labor of being my wife? Benedict, did you hear that? She wants to charge me rent. Benedict Cross didn't laugh. He was staring at the file folder Charlotte had placed on the table. It wasn't a legal pleading. It was a bound document with a corporate logo embossed in silver on the cover. Helios Holdings Group. Sit, Charlotte said again. This time she didn't wait for him to comply. She opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany toward Benedict. Richard remained standing, crossing his arms defiantly. I don't have time for games, Charlotte. I have a company to run. A company that generates millions while you sleep. Actually, Charlotte said, we need to talk about that, too. Sterling Dynamics is currently 3 months behind on its lease payments for the 40th, 41st, and 42nd floors of this building. Richard scoffed. We lease from Helios Holdings, a shell company based in Zurich, My CFO handles it. What on earth would you know about commercial real estate leasing?" "Benedict," Charlotte said, ignoring her husband and addressing the lawyer. "Read the document." Benedict Cross picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the header. Then the first paragraph. His skin, usually a healthy, tanned complexion from weekends in Bermuda, began to drain of color. He looked up at Charlotte, then back at the paper, then at Richard. "Richard," Benedict said, his voice unusually strained. "Sit down." "Why?" Richard demanded, irritated. "What is that?" "It's a deed of trust," Benedict whispered, "and a certificate of incorporation." "So?" "Richard, sit down," Benedict snapped, losing his cool facade. Richard frowned, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. He slowly sank back into his leather chair, his eyes darting between his lawyer and his wife. "What is going on?" Charlotte folded her hands again. "When we met, Richard, you assumed a lot about me. You knew I was a scholarship student at the Art Institute. You knew I worked 2 jobs. You assumed I was poor, destitute even. You were a barista," Richard spat. "You lived in a studio apartment with a radiator that clanked." "I lived there because I wanted to," she corrected. "I wanted to know I could make it on my own, without my family's help. I wanted to be an artist, but my grandfather, he had other plans for me. He insisted I learn the family business." "Family business?" Richard rolled his eyes. "What, a bakery?" "My maiden name is not Sterling," she said quietly. "It's clearly not. It's Vanderkamp." Richard frowned. "So? Charlotte Vanderkamp. Sounds Dutch. Who cares?" Benedict Cross dropped the paper. He looked as if he might be sick. "Richard," the lawyer hissed. "Vanderkamp. As in the Vanderkamp estate. As in huge swaths of Manhattan real estate. They owned the rail yards in the 20s. They own half of the Upper East Side." Richard looked at Charlotte, blinking rapidly. "Vanderkamp? No. You said your parents were dead." "They are," Charlotte said. "I was the sole heir to my grandfather's trust when he passed away, 6 months before we met. I didn't want the money to define me. I didn't want men to want me for my portfolio. So I kept it quiet. I put everything into a blind trust. Helios Holdings." She gestured around the room. "I bought the Aurora Tower 4 years ago, Richard. Through the trust. I approved your lease application personally. I thought it would be nice for you to have a good view." Richard's face went slack. The arrogance, the sneer, the posture, it all evaporated, leaving behind a confused, frightened man. You own this building?" "I own the building," Charlotte confirmed. "I own the land it sits on. I own the parking garage your Porsche is parked in right now. And interestingly enough, I own the building where your mistress, Isabella, currently rents her apartment in Soho. Helios Holdings has a very diverse portfolio." Richard stared at her. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He looked at the room, the office he was so proud of, and suddenly it felt very small. "You're lying," he whispered, grasping for denial. "This is a trick. Arthur put you up to this." Arthur chuckled, packing tobacco into his pipe, though he didn't light it. "I assure you, Mr. Sterling, I am merely here to facilitate the paperwork. Mrs. Sterling, or Ms. Vanderkamp, as she will be reverting to, has been managing her assets quite astutely for years, while you were working late." "Now," Charlotte said, her voice hardening. She opened the folder wider. "Let's discuss the arrears. Sterling Dynamics is in breach of contract. Clause 14B of your lease agreement states that the landlord, me, can terminate the lease immediately upon evidence of reputational damage to the property owner caused by the tenant. And Richard..." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. dragging my name through the mud, flaunting your affair in the tabloids, and trying to leave me penniless. I consider that very damaging to my reputation." She slid a new document across the table. It wasn't a settlement. It was an eviction notice. "You have 48 hours to vacate the premises, Richard. Sterling Dynamics is being evicted from the Aurora Tower." Richard looked at the eviction notice. The blood roared in his ears. "You can't do that. We have servers here. We have infrastructure. It will cost me millions to move." "Then perhaps you shouldn't have offered me cat food money," Charlotte said coolly. "Benedict!" Richard shouted, turning to his lawyer. "Do something! Fix this!" Benedict was frantically texting on his phone, likely checking property records. He looked up, his face pale. "Richard, the records match. The holding company traces back to a trust. The trustee is Arthur Penhaligon." Richard turned to the old man in the tweed jacket. Arthur smiled benignly. "I've managed the Vanderkamp Trust for 40 years. Lovely family. Very private." Richard felt the walls closing in. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "I don't believe it. I'm not leaving. This is my office." "Actually," Charlotte said, checking her own watch, a simple, elegant Cartier she had bought herself yesterday. "Security has already been notified. Since the lease is terminated effective immediately due to the breach, you are technically trespassing." "You wouldn't?" Richard whispered. "Charlotte, I'm your husband." "Not for long," she replied. "And you said it yourself, Richard. Business is business. I'm just maximizing my assets." She stood up, smoothing her dress. "Now, about that divorce settlement. I think we should renegotiate. I'm willing to let you keep the Audi, but I want your shares in Sterling Dynamics." "My shares?" Richard choked. "That's my company. A company with no headquarters, facing a massive lawsuit for back rent and breach of contract," Charlotte pointed out. "Its stock is going to plummet the moment this news hits the street. I'm offering you a lifeline. Give me the controlling interest, and I'll let the company stay in the building. You can stay on as a consultant." Richard looked at her as if she were a stranger. The quiet mouse had become a lioness, and she had her jaws around his throat. "I need to make a call," Richard stammered, backing toward the door. I need to call Isabella." "Oh, you can call her," Charlotte said, picking up her bag. "But she might be busy packing. I just doubled the rent on her apartment." Richard stormed out of the conference room, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He bypassed the elevator bank, too impatient to wait, and shoved open the door to the stairwell, taking the flights down 2 at a time until he reached the executive garage. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys to his Porsche 911. He needed to think. He needed to regroup. But mostly, he needed to hear someone tell him that he was still the king, and that Charlotte was just a bitter woman making empty threats. He dialed Isabella. "Richard?" Her voice was breathless, high-pitched. "Where are you? Do you know what just happened?" "Calm down, baby," Richard said, revving the engine. The roar of the motor usually soothed him, but today it sounded hollow in the cavernous concrete garage, a garage Charlotte apparently owned. "I'm dealing with Charlotte. She's having a breakdown, making wild claims." "Wild claims?" Isabella shrieked. "Richard, the superintendent just hand-delivered a notice. My rent is being adjusted. Adjusted! It says effective immediately. The monthly rate is $35,000, and they're demanding a 6-month security deposit by tomorrow morning, or I face eviction." Richard nearly dropped the phone. $35,000! That's illegal. There are rent control laws. Not for a luxury loft in Soho, listed as a corporate rental, Isabella cried. "The notice came from Helios Holdings." "Who is Helios Holdings, Richard? You said you paid the rent through the company." Richard felt a cold sweat prickle his hairline. Charlotte wasn't bluffing. She was surgically dismantling his life, piece by piece. "I'm coming over," Richard said. "Pack a bag. We'll go to the hotel. We'll figure this out." He sped out of the garage, tires squealing. The drive to Soho was a blur of honking horns and blurred lights. His mind raced. Vanderkamp. How could he have missed it? He remembered seeing old photo albums early in their marriage, black and white pictures of Charlotte on a sprawling estate with horses. He had laughed and asked if she grew up on a farm. She had just smiled and said, "Something like that." He had been so blinded by his own narrative, the self-made genius rescuing the poor girl, that he never bothered to ask the right questions. When he arrived at Isabella's building, a chic cast-iron structure with ivy climbing the brickwork, the doorman, a burly man named Gus, whom Richard had tipped generously for months, stepped in front of him. "Mr. Sterling," Gus said, his face impassive. "I can't let you up." "Excuse me?" Richard snarled, trying to push past. "I pay the rent on 4B. Get out of my way." "Leaseholder is Sterling Dynamics," Gus recited, clearly working from a script. "We received a call from the property management firm, Helios. No employees of Sterling Dynamics are permitted on the premises due to pending litigation regarding property damage. That includes you, sir." "This is insane!" Richard shouted, causing a passing woman with a stroller to hurry away. "Isabella! Isabella, come down!" A window on the 4th floor opened. Isabella leaned out, but she wasn't looking at him with adoration. She was throwing clothes. "Here!" she screamed, tossing one of his bespoke suits out the window. It fluttered down like a wounded bird, landing in a puddle of dirty street water. "Take your trash, Richard." "Isabella, what are you doing?" he yelled up, stunned. "I Googled Helios Holdings," she shouted back, her voice echoing off the brick buildings. "And I Googled Charlotte Vanderkamp. You idiot! You told me she was a nobody. She's practically American royalty. I'm not going to war with the Vanderkamp estate for a man who's about to be homeless." "I am not homeless," Richard roared, his dignity shredding with every word. "I am a CEO." "You're a tenant," she retorted. "And you just got evicted. Don't call me. I found a new sponsor. One who actually owns his own apartment." The window slammed shut. The blinds snapped closed. Richard stood on the sidewalk, his Armani suit jacket getting damp in the light drizzle that had started to fall. Gus, the doorman, looked at the suit in the puddle, then back at Richard. "You want me to get that for you, Mr. Sterling?" Gus asked, not unkindly. "Leave it," Richard muttered. He retreated to his car, the sanctuary of leather and silence. He sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He had lost his office. He had lost his mistress. He was about to lose his home. He pulled out his phone and dialed Benedict Cross. "Benedict," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low timbre. "Stop looking for a settlement. I want war. I want you to find everything you can on the Vanderkamp Trust. If she wants to play dirty, let's see how she likes it when we audit her blind trust for tax fraud. No one holds that much property without hiding money." "Richard," Benedict's voice was cautious. "I've been making calls. It's tight. The Vanderkamp lawyers are formidable. But there is one thing." "What?" "The board meeting," Benedict said. "I just got a notification. An emergency session has been called for tomorrow morning at 8:00 a.m. Location, the Pierre Hotel." "Why the Pierre? Why not the office?" Richard asked. "Because the office is currently being padlocked by the sheriff, Richard," Benedict said dryly. "But here's the kicker. The meeting wasn't called by you or the chairman." "Who called it?" "A proxy holder for the majority share block," Benedict said. They didn't give a name, but Richard, if the investors are spooked, they're going to come for your head. Richard started the car. His eyes were hard, devoid of the panic from earlier. Now, there was only cold rage. "Let them come!" Richard hissed. "I built that company from a laptop in a garage. Charlotte thinks she can buy me out? I'll burn the company to the ground before I let her take it." The Pierre Hotel conference suite smelled of old money, lavender, beeswax, and stale coffee. The board of directors of Sterling Dynamics sat around an oval table, murmuring in hushed tones. These were men Richard had known for years. Harrison Cole, the chairman, a man who had vacationed on Richard's yacht. Simon Vance, the venture capitalist who had backed Richard's Series A funding. They avoided looking at the door. When Richard burst in, flanked by Benedict Cross, the silence that fell over the room was absolute. Richard looked impeccable. He had gone to a hotel, showered, shaved, and bought a new suit that cost $5,000. He needed to project strength. He needed to look like a winner. "Gentlemen," Richard boomed, striding to the head of the table. "I apologize for the change of venue. A minor administrative error with our property management regarding the lease. It will be sorted out by Monday." He threw his briefcase on the table and sat down. "Now, let's get to business. I understand there are concerns." Harrison Cole cleared his throat. He was a silver-haired man with a face etched by decades of corporate warfare. He didn't look at Richard. He looked at a folder in front of him. "It's not a minor administrative error, Richard," Harrison said quietly. "We received a copy of the lawsuit filed by Helios Holdings last night. Breach of contract, defamation, and misuse of company funds." "Misuse?" Richard laughed incredulously. "That's absurd. Every cent is accounted for." "The lawsuit alleges that you used company accounts to lease a residential property in Soho," Simon Vance interjected, peering over his glasses. "Apartment 4B, for a consultant named Isabella Ricci. Is Ms. Ricci on the payroll, Richard?" Richard froze. He looked at Benedict, who was rubbing his temples. That was a perk," Richard stammered. "Executive retention." "She's 24 and a college dropout," Harrison said, tossing a photo of Isabella onto the table. "And she's your mistress. You used shareholder money to house your mistress in a building owned by your wife's holding company. Do you realize how incompetent that makes you look? You handed your wife the gun and drew a target on your own forehead." "I can fix this," Richard insisted, standing up. "I'll pay it back. I'll write a personal check right now. But we cannot let outside forces dictate how this company is run." "It's too late, Richard," Harrison said. "The stock is already down 12% in pre-market trading. The rumor is out that we're homeless, and the CEO is being sued for fraud." "So we fight!" Richard slammed his fist on the table. "We countersue. I am Sterling Dynamics. Without me, this company is nothing." The double doors at the back of the suite opened. "That's a common misconception among founders," a clear, calm voice said. Richard spun around. Charlotte walked in, but she didn't look like the woman he had divorced yesterday. She wore a white power suit, sharp and tailored, looking like a modern-day celestial judgment. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. Behind her walked Arthur Penhaligon and two men in dark suits, carrying heavy briefcases. "You can't be here," Richard spat. "This is a closed board meeting." "Actually," Charlotte said, walking past him to the other end of the table. She didn't sit. She stood, placing her hands on the back of the empty chair opposite Richard. "I'm the largest single shareholder." Richard laughed nervously. "You? You have nothing. The prenup covers marital assets," Arthur Penhaligon spoke up, his voice surprisingly strong. "It does not cover stock purchased on the open market and through private equity channels over the last 18 months. Charlotte nodded to the men in suits, who began distributing leather-bound dossiers to the board members. "Gentlemen," Charlotte addressed the board, ignoring Richard entirely. "Through Helios Holdings and several subsidiary investment vehicles, I have quietly acquired 26% of Sterling Dynamics over the last 2 years. I believed in the product. I just didn't believe in the leadership." The board members flipped through the dossiers. Harrison Cole's eyebrows shot up. "In addition," Charlotte continued, "I have spoken with the chaotic scattering of minority shareholders you've alienated, Richard. I have their proxies. As of this morning, I control 51% of the voting shares." The room went dead silent. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Simon. He looked at Harrison. They were reading the documents, nodding slowly. They weren't fighting her. They were impressed. "This is a hostile takeover," Benedict Cross whispered, stunned. "She's not divorcing you, Richard. She's acquiring you." "I have a proposal," Charlotte said, her voice cool and professional. "Option A. Richard stays. I evict the company permanently from the Aurora Tower. I proceed with the lawsuit regarding the misuse of funds for his mistress, which will likely result in a criminal investigation, and I dump my stock, tanking the company's value to 0. She paused, letting the threat hang in the air like a guillotine blade. "Option B," she continued. "Richard resigns as CEO, effective immediately. He surrenders his remaining shares to the company treasury in exchange for the dismissal of the lawsuit. In return, I will renew the lease at the Aurora Tower at a 10% discount. I will inject $50 million of liquid capital from the Vanderkamp Trust to stabilize the stock. And I will step in as interim chairwoman." Harrison Cole looked up. For the first time all morning, he smiled. "50 million liquid?" Harrison asked. "Transferred today," Charlotte confirmed. Harrison turned to Richard. The look in his eyes wasn't friendly anymore. It was business. "Richard," Harrison said softly, "it's been a good run." "You can't do this," Richard screamed. He looked around the table, desperate. "Simon, I made you rich. You're going to let a housewife take over." "She's not a housewife, Richard," Simon said, closing the folder. "She's a Vanderkamp, and she just outmaneuvered you on every single level. It's strictly business." "I won't sign," Richard hissed, backing away. "I won't resign." "Then we vote," Charlotte said. "All in favor of removing Richard Sterling as CEO." Every hand at the table went up. Even Harrison. Even Simon. Charlotte looked at Richard. Her expression wasn't triumphant. It was almost pitying. "You mocked me at the table, Richard," she said softly, echoing his words from the day before. "You told me to go open a knitting store. You underestimated me because I was quiet. You forgot that in the wild, the predators that make the most noise are usually the first to die. It's the silent ones you have to watch out for." She pointed to the door. "Get out of my building, Richard." Richard stood there, trembling. He looked at the men he thought were his peers, now looking at him like a stranger. He looked at the wife he had disregarded, now towering over him. He grabbed his briefcase. "You haven't won," he snarled, though his voice wavered. "This isn't over. I'll start again. I'll crush you." "You can try," Charlotte said, pulling out a chair and sitting at the head of the table, his seat. "But next time, check who owns the land before you build your castle." Richard turned and fled the room. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, sealing his fate. Inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. "Now," Charlotte said, smoothing the lapel of her white jacket, "let's discuss the Q3 roadmap. I have some ideas about the interface design that I've been dying to share." Harrison Cole leaned forward, respectful and attentive. "We're listening, Ms. Vanderkamp." 3 weeks later, Richard Sterling sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in the Emerald Inn, a roadside motel in Queens that smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. The view from his window wasn't the Manhattan skyline anymore. It was a brick wall and a dumpster that was currently being raided by a very aggressive raccoon. His fall had been absolute. Charlotte hadn't just taken the company, she had frozen the assets. The courts had granted a temporary restraining order on his bank accounts, pending the investigation into the embezzlement regarding Isabella. Isabella, of course, had vanished. The last Richard heard, she was dating a hedge fund manager in Miami. Benedict Cross had formally dropped him as a client via a courier letter, citing conflict of interest and unpaid billable hours. Richard took a swig of cheap bourbon from a plastic cup. He looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror. He looked 10 years older. His eyes were bloodshot, his stubble grey and unkempt. But he wasn't broken. Not yet. He was angry. And anger, Richard found, was a potent fuel. "She thinks she's smart," he muttered to the empty room. "She thinks she can just erase me." He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out the one thing he had managed to salvage before security escorted him out of the Aurora Tower. A small, silver key. It didn't open a bank vault. It opened a floor safe in the master closet of the Hamptons beach house. Charlotte had seized the house, obviously, but the legal transfer of the deed took time. Technically, until the divorce was finalized or the eviction on that specific property was processed, it was still marital property. Or at least he could argue that to a cop if he got caught. But he wasn't going for the silver or the watches. He was going for the backup drive. 5 years ago, Richard had written the core code for Project Zenith, the predictive AI algorithm that made Sterling Dynamics billions. He had kept a raw, unencrypted copy on a terabyte drive in the Hamptons safe, just in case the servers ever went down. Charlotte had the company. She had the building. But if he had the source code, he could rebuild. Or better yet, he could sell it. He grabbed his phone, a burner prepaid model, as he'd smashed his iPhone in a fit of rage, and dialed a number he knew by heart. Gavin Thorpe. A crisp voice answered. Gavin was the CEO of Omnitech, Sterling Dynamics' fiercest rival. For years, Gavin had tried to buy Richard out. Richard had always laughed in his face. "Gavin, it's Richard." Silence on the line. Then a low chuckle. "Richard, I heard you've been having a restructuring of your lifestyle. How's Queens?" "Cut the crap, Gavin," Richard snapped. "Do you still want the Zenith algorithm?" The laughter stopped. Zenith is proprietary to Sterling Dynamics, which is now controlled by... What is her name? "Ms. Vanderkamp, I don't deal in stolen goods, Richard. The liability is too high." "It's not stolen," Richard lied, his voice trembling with adrenaline. "I wrote it. It's my intellectual property. And I have a copy that predates the incorporation of the current entity. It's clean. I'm listening. I can deliver the source code to you tonight. In exchange, I want $10 million, wired to an offshore account in the Caymans, and I want a seat on your board." $5 million, Gavin countered immediately. "And a consultancy role, no board seat. You're toxic right now, Richard. I can't have you on the letterhead." Richard gritted his teeth. $7 million, and the title of Chief Strategy Officer. "Done," Gavin said. "Bring the drive to the private airfield in Teterboro. Hangar 4, tonight at midnight. If the code verifies, the money transfers." Richard hung up. His heart was pounding. $7 million. It was enough to start over, enough to crush Charlotte. He waited until nightfall, then rented a nondescript sedan using a prepaid credit card. The drive to the Hamptons took 2 hours. He parked a mile away from the estate, walking the rest of the way through the dunes, the salt spray stinging his face. The house loomed in the dark, a modern glass monstrosity that he had once loved. It looked empty. No lights. He crept to the back patio. He knew the code to the service entrance. He punched it in, 1198.4. The light blinked green. She hadn't changed the codes. Richard almost laughed out loud. For all her talk of power and Vanderkamp legacy, she was still sloppy. She had forgotten the beach house. He slipped inside, the silence of the house pressing against his ears. He moved quickly to the master bedroom, opened the walk-in closet, and pulled back the rug. The safe was there. He inserted the silver key and turned it. Click. The door swung open. Inside, sitting alone on the velvet lining, was the external hard drive. Richard grabbed it, clutching it to his chest like a holy relic. "Got you," he whispered. He didn't notice the faint red LED light blinking in the corner of the ceiling, hidden within the smoke detector. He didn't notice that the house was a little too quiet. He ran back to the car, the drive burning a hole in his pocket. He drove like a madman to New Jersey, fueled by the promise of revenge. He was going to sell the heart of Charlotte's new company to her worst enemy. He was going to win. Teterboro Airport was desolate at midnight, a flat expanse of concrete under a moonless sky. Hangar 4 was open, bathed in harsh halogen light. Inside, a sleek Gulfstream jet sat waiting. Standing by the stairs of the jet was Gavin Thorpe, wearing a trench coat, flanked by 2 bodyguards. Richard pulled the rental car up and jumped out. He held the hard drive up. "Do you have the money?" Richard shouted over the wind. Gavin nodded to one of his men, who held up a tablet showing a bank transfer screen. "Ready to execute. Let's see the goods." Richard walked forward, his legs shaking. He handed the drive to Gavin. Gavin plugged it into a ruggedized laptop sitting on a crate. He typed furiously for a minute. Lines of code scrolled down the screen. "It's the kernel, all right?" Gavin muttered, impressed. "The Zenith Predictive Engine. Complete architecture." "Transfer the funds," Richard demanded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I want to see the confirmation." Gavin looked at Richard, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You really are desperate, aren't you, Richard? You built a billion-dollar company, and here you are, fencing code in a hangar like a common criminal." "I'm taking back what's mine," Richard spat. "Do it!" Gavin hit a key on the laptop. "Transfer initiated." Richard's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. A notification from his newly opened Cayman account. Balance, $7,000. He let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a month. He was rich again. He was safe. "Pleasure doing business," Richard said, turning to leave. "I wouldn't go just yet," a voice echoed from the shadows of the hangar. Richard froze. It wasn't Gavin. From behind the landing gear of the Gulfstream, a figure stepped out. It was Charlotte. She was wearing a trench coat over her shoulders, her arms crossed. Beside her stood Arthur Penhaligon, and, more terrifyingly, 4 officers wearing jackets emblazoned with FBI. "Charlotte?" Richard gasped. He looked at Gavin. "You set me up?" Gavin shrugged, closing the laptop. "Strictly business, Richard. Ms. Vanderkamp called me 3 hours before you did. She offered Omnitech a legitimate licensing deal for the Zenith technology. Fully legal, fully supported, at a very competitive rate. All I had to do was keep you on the line." You traitor!" Richard lunged at Gavin, but the bodyguards caught him easily, pinning his arms back. "It's not betrayal, Richard," Charlotte said, walking closer. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the concrete floor. "It's market forces. Gavin is a smart businessman. He knows better than to buy stolen property from a desperate man." "It's not stolen!" Richard screamed, struggling. "I wrote it! It's my code!" "Arthur," Charlotte said calmly. Arthur stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, under the intellectual property clauses of your employment contract with Sterling Dynamics, a contract you drafted yourself, all code created during your tenure belongs solely to the corporation. Furthermore, taking that code off premises after your termination constitutes theft of trade secrets under the Economic Espionage Act." "But I got it from the house," Richard yelled. "My house." "The house is titled to the trust," Charlotte corrected. "And as for the drive," she smiled, a cold, sharp expression. "Did you really think I forgot the codes, Richard? I knew you kept a backup. I left it there. I left the code to the house active. I knew that when you ran out of money, you'd go back for the one thing you thought had value." She stopped a few feet from him. "It's called a honeypot, Richard. In cybersecurity terms, it's a trap set to detect, deflect, or, in some manner, counteract attempts at unauthorized use of information systems. You walked right into it." "The money." Richard looked at his phone. "I have the money." "Look closer," Gavin said, suppressing a laugh. Richard looked at the screen. The notification was fading. It was a mock interface, a demo mode. "0, Charlotte said. "You have 0. The FBI agents moved in. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Richard Sterling," the lead agent said, reciting the words that signaled the end of his life as he knew it. "You are under arrest for industrial espionage, grand larceny, and breaking and entering." Richard felt the cold steel click around his wrists. He looked at Charlotte, his eyes wide with shock and fear. "Charlotte, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't do this. I'm your husband. We were in love once. Please." Charlotte looked at him. For a second, her expression softened, remembering the man in the coffee shop 12 years ago. But then she remembered the eviction notice he had tried to give her. She remembered the ridicule. She remembered the years of feeling small so he could feel big. "We were never in love, Richard," she said softly. "You were in love with yourself. I was just the audience." She turned to the FBI agent. "Take him." As they dragged Richard toward the waiting black SUVs, he screamed her name, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. Charlotte watched him go. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Arthur. "Are you all right, Ms. Vanderkamp?" Charlotte took a deep breath of the cold night air. It tasted like jet fuel and freedom. "I'm fine, Arthur," she said. She turned to Gavin Thorpe. "I'll have the licensing contract sent over to your legal team in the morning. Don't try to renegotiate the royalty rate, Gavin. You saw what happened to the last man who tried to cheat me." Gavin nodded, looking genuinely respectful. "I wouldn't dream of it, Charlotte." She walked toward her own car, a vintage Jaguar that had belonged to her grandfather, waiting on the tarmac. "Let's go home, Arthur," she said. "I have a company to run." 1 year later, the morning sun hit the glass facade of the Aurora Tower, now renamed the Vanderkamp Building, turning it into a pillar of gold. Inside the penthouse office on the 50th floor, the air was warm, smelling of fresh orchids and expensive coffee. The sterile chill of Richard's era was gone. Charlotte stood by the window, looking down at the city. She wore a soft cream sweater and tailored trousers. She didn't need power suits to prove she was in charge anymore. The numbers did that for her. Under her leadership, the company, rebranded as Vanderkamp Technologies, had seen a 40% increase in revenue. The stock was at an all-time high. But more importantly, the culture had changed. The toxic, competitive atmosphere Richard had cultivated was gone, replaced by a collaborative environment that actually valued its engineers. "Ms. Vanderkamp?" Charlotte turned. Her new assistant, a bright young man named Leo, stood in the doorway holding a tablet and a plain white envelope. "The team is ready for the Q4 review," Leo said. "And there's a letter for you. From upstate." Charlotte's expression remained calm. She took the envelope. The return address was stamped clearly. Otisville Correctional Facility. She didn't open it. She knew what it would say. Richard had sent 3 letters since his conviction. The first was angry, blaming her for entrapping him. The second was pathetic, begging for money for the commissary. This one, she suspected, would be a mix of both. Richard had taken a plea deal, 5 years for economic espionage and fraud. He had lost everything: his reputation, his fortune, his freedom. Even Isabella had testified against him to save her own skin, revealing to the court that Richard had promised her company stock that didn't exist. Charlotte walked to the shredder by her desk. She fed the unopened envelope into the machine. The grinding sound was short, sharp, and deeply satisfying. "Leo," she said, dusting off her hands, "tell the mailroom to stop forwarding these. Return to sender." "Understood," Leo said with a nod. "Oh, and Mr. Penhaligon is here for the lunch meeting." Arthur walked in, looking spry for 73. He was wearing a new tweed jacket and a smile that reached his eyes. "Charlotte," he beamed, "the quarterly reports look excellent. Your grandfather would have been very proud. You've done more with the trust in 12 months than we did in 12 years. "I think he would have been proud that I finally stood up for myself," Charlotte said, picking up her tablet. She walked with Arthur toward the elevator. As they passed the main reception area, she saw a new art installation in the lobby. It was a painting she had done years ago, a vibrant, abstract piece of a blue bird breaking out of a gold cage. Richard had always called it amateur trash and made her keep it in the basement. Now it hung in the center of the lobby, valued at $20,000 by a local gallery, though it wasn't for sale. "You know," Arthur said as they stepped into the elevator, "you never did rent out the penthouse apartment after Richard left." "No," Charlotte smiled, pressing the button for the lobby. "I'm turning it into an incubator space for female entrepreneurs. Startups that need a leg up. I figure I should give someone else the key to the building, but this time on their own terms." The elevator doors closed, carrying them down. Charlotte didn't look back. She didn't need to. She owned the ground beneath her feet, the roof over her head, and for the first time in her life, she owned her future. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of how Charlotte turned the tables on the husband who thought he could throw her away like yesterday's trash. Richard thought power came from shouting, flashy suits, and belittling others. He learned the hard way that real power is silence, strategy, and owning the deed to the land your enemy stands on. In the end, Charlotte didn't just win the divorce, she won her life back. It's a powerful reminder to never underestimate the quiet ones, because while you're busy making noise, they might just be buying the building. If you enjoyed this story of sweet revenge and justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Share this video with a friend who loves a good drama twist. What would you have done in Charlotte's shoes? Would you have sent Richard to jail or just left him penniless? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.